by bringing in a verdict of not guilty.
Thank you very much, Mr. Adams. If I may be so bold, may I suggest that you might want to consider running for president sometime. Now, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, distinguished guests, I'm now going to turn the floor over to my distinguished colleague and good friend, Judge Susan Handy, who's going to lead our discussion. Good morning, Judge Handy.
Good morning. And ladies of the jury, you will note that Attorney Horton referred to you as gentlemen of the jury because, as we all know, in those archaic times when this case came about, women were not allowed to be seated as jurors. Women were not allowed to be attorneys. Women were basically not allowed to do anything. So I welcome your presence here this morning. There are really, if this were a real case in real time, what would be happening now is exactly what Attorney Kane and Attorney Horton were referring to. Judge Holtzberg would be instructing you on the law to apply to the facts that you had heard as jurors during the pendency of the case. Because we cannot do that today for time considerations, I'm going to simply ask you some questions to try and get you to think about the arguments that both Attorney Horton and Attorney Kane have made to see what kind of verdict you might have come to if, in fact, you had an opportunity to apply the law to the facts and then retire to the jury room to deliberate. And if that had happened, the very first thing that normally happens after a foreperson is chosen is that you might take a preliminary vote. And remember, there were two cases here. There was the first case against Captain Preston, and the issue in that particular case was whether or not he ordered his soldiers to fire. And I'm assuming Captain Preston is the gentleman there with the white stripes across his red shirt to designate him from the other soldiers. And the second case was against the 8 soldiers to make a determination about whether or not they actually fired without an order or whether they were acting in self-defense. So let's start with the issue of Captain Preston, and let's take a preliminary vote. And ladies, based on the evidence that you heard this morning, how many of you would have voted to convict Captain Preston? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And how many of you would have voted to acquit Captain Preston? Well, we have a tie, gentlemen. Your vote equally as convincing. Now, perhaps someone can tell me who voted to convict why you felt that he was responsible for what happened. Now, I've had you girls in front of me before. I know you're not meek and shy, so you can talk to me. Yes?
I would just say that there wasn't enough, there wasn't enough evidence for me saying that this mob of people was really going to attack him personally. He should have more control over his troops. Okay. And if he felt they were in that much danger, they should have used a different way of force, maybe retreated a little bit. And I know in John Adams' argument that he raised was that, you know, that they were protecting the Treasury and all this stuff, that there was no indication that they were going to come after the Treasury. And I think if the troops had just retreated, there wouldn't have been that kind of a case.
And perhaps we wouldn't have had anybody die.
Yeah.
Okay. Other opinions on that in relationship to Captain Preston? Ladies. Yes.
Well, the fact remains that, like, even when the first shot was fired, there was no order to cease the rest of the fire, so people were killed because of it.
And that was the point that Attorney Kane made.
Right.
In the back there?
I was going to say the same thing.
Okay. All right. Now, the second thing that you would have had to have decided is whether or not the remaining 8 soldiers, that was the second case. And I know both counsel argued both cases in front of you today in their closing argument, but there were actually 2 trials that took place. The first trial was the trial of Captain Preston. And incidentally, do you all know what happened to Captain Preston? Yes? Tell me.
He was acquitted.
He was acquitted. That's correct.
Yeah. By the way,
and he's making a really stupid face right now.
if they were tried together, I would have had conflict of interest.
That's
because I would have had to blame him.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Now, as to the 8 soldiers, the issue is, did they fire in self-defense, or did they fire because there was all this hatred and animosity that was going on? Let's remember, these were British soldiers. They were living in the city of Boston. As Attorney Horton pointed out, many of them had taken over private homes, were living quartered in private homes. general population in Boston was not very pleased about that situation. They didn't like being monitored by soldiers, having them living in their homes. So there was a lot of animosity going on between the British military and the population, the general population of Boston. So the second case that you would need to decide, if you were actually deliberating, is whether or not these 8 acted in self-defense or simply fired on these citizens who, from the information that we have presented, didn't have any guns or knives or swords, rather had sticks and rocks and snowballs. So, how many of you would have voted to convict the soldiers? And we have 6 hands. And how many of you would have voted to acquit the soldiers? All right, so those of you who would have voted to acquit, I'm going to pick on you. You tell me why.
Well, in order to convict these 8 soldiers, it would need to be proven beyond a reasonable doubt. And I don't think it's right to convict 8 soldiers to death when there really isn't any solid evidence from any one of the sides.
Okay. Yes.
And plus, with the depositions of some of the people, both the victim and I think a soldier, that there was a snowballs fired at like the first person who shot. So it was self-defense that when you don't think about it, if there's something hard being thrown at you, you just kind of act in self-defense. You step out of the way and try to get it back.
But there's this whole concept of reasonable force. Is it reasonable if somebody throws a snowball at you? Now, I think there was some argument from probably Mr. Adams that the snowball was hard as ice. Let's assume that's true. Let's assume this was a snowball packed with ice. It was going to make a pretty big impact if it hit someone. Is the response to that, is the force reasonable that you then shoot your musket? That's an issue that you would have to decide. How do you feel about that?
I feel like if the snowball was hard as ice, it could definitely, if you hit the person in the head, it would kill them.
Okay.
So I believe that, yeah.
All right. Uh-huh.
Well, I voted to have them guilty because I can't remember who said it, but someone said taunting isn't really something that you would act in self-defense against.
All right.
And if the entire crowd was taunting the person, then they might have just gotten all worked up and thought that it was self-defense, but you're still killing someone when
All
you
right.
shoot.
Okay. Other comments about this? Yes.
I voted to have them guilty because even as soldiers, they should have known better to retreat from the situation rather than just shooting into the crowd. So I believe animosity was a big part of this entire situation and that their rage took control of their better judgment.
Okay. Yes.
I voted to have them not guilty when I had voted their head soldier to be found guilty because I think someone needs to be held responsible to like set kind of like a precedent that it's not right to just kill civilians. But I don't think that all the soldiers should be convicted because their head should have had more control over them and should have more, if it's self-defense, maybe it was, maybe it wasn't, but that he should have made them feel more comfortable with his judgment, his ruling that they wouldn't have been harmed, so they wouldn't have had to do that. Or maybe he just didn't and he broke down, so then they broke down. So I don't think they should have been found guilty of it because there wasn't enough order from their instructor.
Okay. How about the fact that there were, including Captain Preston, there were 9 individuals, 9 soldiers. 5 people were killed. You heard both Attorney Horton and Attorney Kane indicate that a musket can only have 1 shot. So there were 5 people killed. We've got 9 people on trial. Do the math. Not my forte, but do the math. What do you think about that? Because one of you just said, I don't think they all should have been found guilty. What actually happened in reality? You've read the synopsis. What happened to the soldiers? Do you remember? Yes.
Well, there were children and teenagers and adults with weapons in the crowd, and they were throwing snowballs as hard as ice. It's possible that when they were throwing, they hit other people in the crowd. It could have caused injury to some of the people, maybe not killed, but
Okay.
it's possible it wasn't all the soldiers' fault. So So
That's an excellent point. Yes?
It said that 6 were wounded and 5 were killed, so
Right.
that's 11. So I think that because they only shoot one at a
Okay.
time. But then
How can we convict 9 people of 5 murders? We have 5 dead people. Any thoughts on that? Would you be talking about that in the jury room?
There's no way of knowing whose bullet killed those 5 people. Like,
Okay.
each one of the 9 people shot one shot, and there's 5 people dead, not 9.
Okay.
And there's no way of knowing which of the 9 bullets killed each one of the 5 people.
So how would you resolve that in the jury room then?
Well, I voted not guilty.
Okay, well, you resolved it. Over here.
I think that they would all still be guilty because if they all shot a gun, then they all had an intent to kill someone.
Mhm.
So it doesn't matter which 5 of them actually succeeded, but they all tried to kill a person.
All right.
But the intent does not make it murder. It's just attempted murder. If they did have the intent to shoot, then they shouldn't be on trial
For murder?
for murder and be hanged as a result.
Okay.
Was there a conspiracy, Tom?
Well, there wasn't, but it's sounding like one. Yes, go ahead.
well, I still think that there was a lot of controversy about whether Preston told them they could shoot or not.
Okay.
I think
And remember, they weren't supposed to be able to shoot unless the order came from their commanding officer.
Right. So I think unless they directly looked at him and heard the word fire, whether it had to have come from his mouth and the exact sentence, like, you can fire, they shouldn't have shot. Because, they don't know who else gave the order, and it can only come from him for them to be able to shoot.
Plus, there was all the confusion about the bells ringing and that indicating a fire and members of the crowd shouting fire as well.
Right.
Okay.
So unless they heard it from him, they shouldn't have shot.
Okay. Someone in the back, who wanted to say something.
Well, I mean, I was kind of just going to say that the intent didn't matter if they intended to kill them or not. We don't know which one of these defendants were the ones to actually have the bullet to kill them, so they shouldn't be charged for a murder that they didn't commit. It's a completely different charge, attempt murder, and that's not what's on trial right now, so.
Okay. And what happened in the trial of the 8 soldiers? Do you remember from your reading materials? What actually happened to these 8 individuals? You know that Captain Preston was acquitted. What happened with the other 8 soldiers? Anyone remember? My recollection is that, and I'm going to look at my notes, I believe 2 of the soldiers were found guilty, Kilroy and Gray, for manslaughter, and the other 6 were acquitted. No, I'm sorry, I think,
Yeah, that's
was that right?
That's correct.
That's right. Two were found guilty and the other 6 were acquitted. The punishment, however, was still death, but,
No, it was, they had benefit of clergy.
well, that's what I was going to
Oh.
say. It was death, but then they had the benefit of the clergy, something that's not available to our defendants today. Do you all remember what that was? Because I found that quite interesting. Anyone? Well, perhaps our lawyers can.
I was going to say, have they read the Scarlet Letter?
Have you read the Scarlet Letter?
Yes.
Okay. And, of course, you remember that Hawthorne, in his rendition of that novel, did what to Hester Prynne? She had an A emblazoned on her forehead, remember, for adultery. Well, the benefit of clergy was you could pray for the benefit of clergy, and of course most people couldn't read then, so that you were supposed to actually read something. I think they had maybe alleviated that rule or something, so they didn't make them read. But instead of dying and being put to death, the benefit of clergy allowed you to have your right thumb branded with an M for murder. So you would walk around and people would know that you had committed a murder. And I guess that was your one pass, right? I have a lot of defendants who appear before me right now who would go for that pass, but we don't have that. We don't have. Yeah, that's right. They have a lot of tattoos, but that one is not going to work. But I found that was quite interesting. I also found it interesting that you were completely split, 50-50, on both either to convict or acquit Captain Preston or to convict and acquit the other 8 soldiers. So I would say that both Attorney Kane and Attorney Horton were equally convincing. And with that, I would like to thank all of you, and we are so proud of you all and wish you well.